The wind rolled off the Sierra Nevada like a ghost's breath, scattering ash and snow across the half-burnt remains of a mining camp. Beneath the ruin stood a man the West had already begun to forget, James Pierson Beckwourth, the mixed-blood trapper, warrior, and gunslinger who'd once ridden with Crow chiefs and led white men through mountain passes they thought impassable. Beckwourth never fit in the neat categories of frontier legend. He wasn't white enough for the chroniclers of the West, nor obedient enough for the Army's payroll. Born around 1798 inches, Virginia, to a white father and an enslaved mother of African descent, he was freed young and apprenticed as a blacksmith. But his heart, like so many restless men of the early republic, pulled toward the western horizon, toward danger, riches, and the pure silence of the mountains. By the 1822, Beckwourth had joined William Ashley's fur-trapping enterprise, alongside the likes of Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger, names that would later be carved into the myth of the Rocky Mountains. The company's men moved through the Yellowstone and Wind River country, living on buffalo, beaver, and grit. Beckwourth's own journal, dictated years later to T.D. Bonner, told of long winters under elk-hide shelters, of frost-bitten feet thawed by firelight, of losing comrades to crow arrows and grizzly claws. It was with those same crows that Beckwourth found his truest home. Captured or perhaps adopted by a band near the Bighorn, he rose through their ranks, eventually becoming a war chief. He took crow wives, rode against the Blackfeet, and carried a lance bound with eagle feathers. "The lodges were my lodges," he later said. "Their blood became my blood." But to the white world, his life in the Crow Nation was unforgivable. In the published Adventures of James P. Beckwourth 1856, editors softened his story, erasing what didn't fit the mold of a noble frontiersman. Some called him a liar. Others ignored him altogether. Yet modern historians, drawing on the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal and Larpenteur's 40 Years a Fur Trader, confirm his presence across the Missouri and Yellowstone, at Fort Union, Fort Laramie, and in the ledgers of the American Fur Company. He was there, always in the margins, always written small. By the time the California Gold Rush ignited in 1848, Beckwourth was already a veteran of countless mountain crossings. It was then he discovered what would make him briefly famous: Beckwourth Pass, a low, snow-sheltered route through the Sierra Nevada near present-day Portola, California. He guided emigrants west through the high country, saving hundreds from starvation and frostbite. "The road was my gift to the people," he later told DeWitt Peters. But the people forgot the giver. He opened a trading post, dealt in horses and arms, and watched as the same miners he'd saved turned the land into dust. Violence came often. The newspapers called him the mulatto gunslinger. The title fit. Beckwourth was quick with a rifle and quicker with his pride. In one recorded fight near Marysville, he faced down 3 men who tried to cheat him of furs. 2 walked away, wounded. 1 didn't walk at all. Yet for all his defiance, time worked against him. The world of beaver pelts and buffalo robes was dying. The mountain man was becoming a ghost in his own land, replaced by surveyors, railroads, and government treaties. Beckwourth's name faded, not because he lacked courage or skill, but because his very existence challenged the myth of the West as a white man's frontier. When he died in 1866 while guiding an army column through Crow country, there was no grand obituary, only a note from a soldier's journal. Beckwourth died of natural causes, buried near the river by his friends among the Crows. But history has a way of circling back. The Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming, now displays his likeness beside Bridger's and Smith's. The American Mountain Men Association lists him among the fur trade originals. Scholars like Win Blevins and Leroy Hafen write of his skill as a linguist, a diplomat, and a survivor, an unbreakable thread in the great fabric of the early West. The gunslinger the West tried to erase was never gone. His trail runs deep in the mountain passes, the Crow lodges, and the faded pages of journals that refused to lie. When the gold fever rolled west like wildfire, it burned through everything, mountains, forests, and men alike. But there was one place the flames never reached: Up in the pine-shadowed basins of what is now Plumas and Sierra County, a small people stood quietly watching as the world went mad for yellow metal. They called themselves the Maidu, or Mountain People. For centuries they had lived in that country of granite and clear rivers between the Yuba, Feather, and American watersheds. Their lodges were dug half into the earth, roofed with bark and woven mats, warm in winter, cool in summer. They fished the cold creeks for salmon, gathered acorns from the black oaks, and traded obsidian and woven baskets with their Washoe and Miwok neighbors. When the first trappers came, men like Jedediah Smith and James Beckwourth, cutting through the Sierra trails, the Maidu treated them not as enemies, but as curiosities. They bartered dried venison for knives, baskets for blankets. But when the gold rush began, courtesy of a glittering pebble found at Sutter's Mill in 1848, the Maidu's world turned to chaos overnight. Tens of thousands of miners flooded into the Feather River country. Whole hillsides were washed into the creeks. Forests were felled to build flumes and sluices. The rivers turned the color of blood and clay. By 1850, the U.S. Census counted almost 100,000 miners across the Sierra foothills, and the Maidu, perhaps 20,000 strong before contact, were being pushed toward extinction. Their hunting grounds were fenced off. Their women were taken for camp labor. Smallpox and cholera tore through their villages faster than bullets. And yet, they survived. According to accounts preserved in the National Frontier Trails Museum archives and the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, the Maidu never declared open war on the miners. They didn't build forts or lead grand assaults like the Plains tribes. Their resistance was quieter, cleverer, a kind of mountain warfare the prospectors couldn't see until it was too late. They used knowledge of terrain as their greatest weapon. In the high country near the Feather River's North Fork, miners spoke of phantom camps that vanished overnight. Their food stores disappeared, their mules cut loose, their guides gone missing. One prospector, Henry Bigler, wrote in his 1851 diary, "These mountain Indians, they take nothing by chance. They come by night, silent as owls. You can't follow their trail come morning the rocks keep, no footprints." When gold seekers tried to follow Maidu paths into the high canyons, they often found themselves lost in circles. The trails would fork into false leads, then end in rock walls or dense thickets. The Maidu called it the mountain's revenge. Historians now understand it as deliberate misdirection, an intelligence network woven through the terrain itself. In the oral traditions recorded by James Willard Schultz in My Life as an Indian, and echoed by ethnographers like Alfred Kroeber later on, there's mention of a secluded valley deep in the northern Sierra, a place where the Maidu guided their families when the miners came. Hidden behind granite ridges and pine timber, with streams feeding from underground springs, it was a refuge unreachable by wagon or horse. They grew roots, hunted deer, and waited while the fever burned itself out. For decades, local settlers whispered of the Lost Maidu Valley, a place no white man could find twice. In 1873, a surveyor from Nevada City claimed he stumbled into it, a settlement of some 30 Indians living as if the world had never changed. But when he returned with others, the valley was gone in the fog. Modern scholars suggest the story refers to an upland basin near Spanish Peak, its trails deliberately obscured, its entrances camouflaged by stone cairns. Whether myth or memory, the legend endures because it captures something true. The Maidu's survival wasn't luck, it was design. Where miners saw gold, the Maidu saw folly. They understood that every pan of earth taken from the river poisoned the water and killed the salmon that sustained them, so they struck where it hurt most, not with weapons, but with scarcity. When miners traded for supplies, the Maidu refused to sell food or hides unless paid in full. They rationed fish to settlers who overhunted. And in the winters, when snow buried the mountain passes, they alone knew how to move through the drifts. More than one prospector train owed its survival to Maidu guides, who then vanished before the snow melted, leaving no trace. By the mid-1852, newspapers out of Marysville and Grass Valley began to call them the Vanished Tribe. Yet while the gold fields emptied and the rivers ran dry, the Maidu still occupied their high country lodges. They'd done what few nations managed. They had let the West destroy itself and quietly endured. Their defiance wasn't without loss. U.S. military expeditions, recorded in National Park Service archives, document several punitive raids between 1,850 and 1,860, especially around Honey Lake and the Yuba headwaters. The Maidu villages were burned, and survivors taken to reservations near Round Valley and Nevada City. But unlike many displaced tribes, the Maidu never fully vanished. Small bands returned each spring to their ancestral lands. They rebuilt sweat lodges. They relit fires. By the late 19th century, ethnographers from the Smithsonian found them still living by the old ways, still making acorn bread, still teaching children to read the forest for signs. The miners were long gone, their ghosts rusting in abandoned sluices. The Maidu had outlasted them all. Today, the Maidu Museum and Historic Site in Roseville, California, stands on ground once scarred by the gold rush. The tribe's descendants still hold ceremonies each year, honoring what they call the time of smoke, when strangers came chasing the sun and never found their way back. Historians from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal and Give Your Heart to the Hawks now recognize the Maidu not as victims of the frontier, but as master strategists of survival, quiet, patient, enduring. Their story isn't one of conquest or rebellion, but of outlasting history itself. When the gold was gone, when the rivers cleared and the mountains healed, the Maidu were still there, just as the wind still moves through the pines above the Feather River, whispering of the tribe the rush could never find. The snow began early that year, first as dust on the high peaks, then as an avalanche of white that sealed the wilderness shut. The trappers called it the Winter of No End. By December, the Green River country lay buried beneath 6 feet of snow. Beavers slept beneath the ice. Elk vanished into the dark timber. And scattered across that endless cold were perhaps 200 men, the finest mountain trappers of their generation, cut off from supply, starving, and running out of luck. One of them was Jedediah Strong Smith. Another was Jim Bridger, young then, with frost crusted into his beard. They had come west that autumn with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, led by William Sublett, chasing beaver pelts that could fetch their weight in silver in St. Louis. What they found instead was the raw, merciless face of the Rockies. Smith's journal, later recovered after his death, spoke of that winter with the tone of a man testing the edge of human endurance. The snows fell for 20 days straight. Our horses perished. We built huts of willow and buffalo hide, buried them to the eaves, and fed on what meat we had left. God alone knows how we endured. Bridger's later recollections, preserved in the Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West, confirm it. Their camp lay along the upper Green River, near present-day Pinedale, Wyoming, the same country now home to the Museum of the Mountain Man. The trappers hunted daily, but game grew scarce. The rivers froze to stone. Men boiled old moccasins and leather straps to stay alive. Charles Larpenteur, who wintered not far to the north, wrote that men looked like ghosts, and the wolves no longer feared them. Still, the mountain men endured, bound by stubbornness and a code that was half courage, half madness. They trapped, traded, and kept their powder dry even as the West itself tried to kill them. In those frozen months, alliances meant survival. Smith's company traded with passing Shoshone bands for dried roots and fish, exchanging powder and lead for life itself. The trappers learned to dig into snowbanks, to sleep beneath buffalo robes with fires buried in pits to hide their smoke. Out of these crucibles, the law of the mountains was born, each man for himself and every man for his brother. From such winters came legends that still echo through the archives of the American Mountain Men Association and the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. One tells of Hugh Glass, mauled by a grizzly in 1823, crawling 200 miles to Fort Kiowa through frost and pain. Another of John Coulter, stripped naked by the Blackfeet, outrunning his pursuers across the Madison Plains. These stories weren't embellishment, they were survival distilled into folklore. The winter of 1,830 broke many men, but for those who endured, it also tempered them into something the frontier had never seen before, an order of wanderers who could outlast the wilderness itself. When our spring finally broke, it came with thunder. The ice on the green cracked like cannon fire, and the trappers stumbled out of their burrows, blinking into sunlight. By July, they gathered at Pierre's Hole for what would become the most famous Rocky Mountain rendezvous in history. Hundreds came: trappers, Crow and Shoshone traders, French voyageurs, and mountain women wrapped in bright blankets. There was whiskey, laughter, and trading so fierce that a man could swap one beaver pelt for a new rifle before breakfast and lose both by sundown. Larpenteur called it a city of hides and powder kegs. Others said it was the wildest celebration ever held west of the Mississippi. But beneath the laughter ran a quiet understanding. They had all survived the winter, and that survival bound them tighter than any treaty. Jedediah Smith stood apart from the crowd, writing in his small leather-bound journal. His faith was strong, his manner serious, but even he must have felt the strange joy of having beaten death once again. Within a year, he'd ride south toward Santa Fe and meet his end at the hands of Comanche warriors. Bridger would live to old age, building forts and guiding wagon trains across the same passes that had nearly killed him. The mountain men didn't just trap beaver, they mapped the bones of the continent. From the Missouri to the Sacramento, their trails became the skeleton of America's westward march. Modern historians, from Bernard DeVoto's Across the Wide Missouri to Irving Stone's Men to Match My Mountains, remind us that these weren't mythical figures, but hard, mortal men. They buried their dead in unmarked graves, carved their names into cottonwoods, and carried the story of the frontier in calloused hands. But that winter, the winter of no end, marked a turning point. The fur trade began to decline soon after. Fashion changed in Europe. Silk hats replaced beaver felt. The trappers found fewer pelts, fewer profits. By the 1842nd, the age of the mountain man was fading. Forts turned into settlements, and the wilderness they once ruled filled with wagon trains and preachers. Yet the memory of that season, the hunger, the frost, the fellowship stayed alive in the old men who survived it. Charles Larpenteur wrote in 1851, "Those winters made us what we were. We came out of them lean as wolves and twice as cunning. No storm, no hunger, no man could frighten us after that." There's a story told by reenactors of the American Mountain Men Association, a legend more than a fact, but one that carries the truth of the time. In the late 1832, when the last rendezvous had ended and most trappers drifted east or south, a small band of them gathered one final night near the Wind River. Bridger was there, they say, and an aging trapper named Fitzpatrick. They built a fire, passed the whiskey, and spoke of all they'd seen: the rivers that had no end, the snow that tried to bury them, the men who never came back. When dawn came, Bridger stood and said, "Boys, we've seen the best of it. The mountains'll never be ours again." Then he walked away down the trail, his rifle over his shoulder, and the others watched until he was just another shadow moving into the sunrise. History doesn't record that moment, but it feels true to the silence of the wilderness that still holds their bones, true to the grit of men who measured their lives not in years, but in winters survived. Because that's what the mountain men left us: not gold, not glory, but a way of facing the impossible and walking through it anyway. And every time the snow comes down on the Green River country, the wind still whispers through the pines the names of those who refused to die when the world turned white. The wind that rolled across the sage smelled of dust, buffalo dung, and old fire. On the open plains, where the mountain light burned white against the Tetons, a man stood watching the slow wagons of a government survey creep across his land. His name was James Bridger, and by then the frontier already belonged to other men, men with compasses, not traps. He had seen it all. The fur trade rise and die, the tribes pushed to hunger, the wilderness parceled into lines on paper. Yet Bridger remained, gray-bearded and hard-eyed, a living map of the world that had once belonged to the mountain men. Bridger was born in 1804, near Richmond, Virginia. His parents were farmers, modest and restless, who moved west along the frontier like so many others seeking open ground. By 13, he was an orphan. By 17, he was a boatman on the Missouri, ferrying supplies for fur companies that clawed their way upriver toward the unknown. In 1822, he signed on with General William Ashley's fabled 100, the same company that carried Jedediah Smith, Thomas Fitzpatrick, James Beckwourth, and Hugh Glass into legend. They were boys then, not yet 30, and the land before them had no names. Bridger was barely 18 when he reached the mouth of the Yellowstone and first saw the vast, rolling sea of grass that stretched farther than any man could ride in a day. The fur trade hardened him quickly. In the company journals preserved in Leroy Hafin's The Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West, Bridger appears again and again, quiet, dependable, tireless. He was with Jedediah Smith in 1824 when they discovered South Pass, the low break in the Rocky Mountains that would one day carry 500,000 emigrants west. Later, in 1825, when the party trapped along the Bear River, Bridger followed it north and became, at least by tradition, the first white man to see the Great Salt Lake. He thought it was part of the Pacific Ocean. His report was mocked in St. Louis, but later expeditions proved him right about the lake's size and salinity. He wasn't a man of letters, but his eyes never lied. He read the land better than any scholar ever could. In those he SPTO. 2 years, danger was constant. He crossed paths with the Blackfeet, the Crow, and the Snake. Sometimes he traded, sometimes he fought. In one skirmish on the Yellowstone, a musket ball tore through his shoulder. The wound healed crooked, leaving one arm shorter than the other, but he never complained. The mountains were a merciless teacher, and Bridger was its best student. By the late 1832, the fur trade was dying. Beaver pelts no longer fetched the fortunes they once had, and the rendezvous system, that wild annual festival of whiskey and powder, was fading into memory. Bridger saw the change coming. He and a partner, Louis Vasquez, turned their knowledge of the trails into enterprise. In 1843 they built Fort Bridger, a low cluster of adobe and log buildings beside the Green River, where wagon trains could rest, trade, and repair their stock before crossing the Great Basin. The fort became the crossroads of the West. The Oregon Trail passed through. So did the California Trail, and later the Mormon Trail. Within a few years, Bridger's small post was the heartbeat of overland migration. He sold blacksmith work, fresh horses, and guides to settlers chasing dreams they didn't understand. Brigham Young and his Mormon pioneers arrived in 1847. At first, they traded freely, but soon tension grew. Bridger's whiskey and guns were too tempting for native allies, and Young's new colony in the Salt Lake Valley wanted control of the trade. By 1853, Mormon militia seized the fort while Bridger was away, accusing him of illegal dealings. He returned to find his storehouse looted, his powder stolen, his flagpole cut down. He rode east in silence. He had seen empires rise and vanish before. This was no different. If the wilderness had taken his youth, it paid him back in skill. Bridger became the West's most sought-after guide. He led the Stansbury expedition through the Great Salt Lake Basin in 1849, helped the Army Corps of Engineers chart the Yellowstone country, and guided Captain Howard Stansbury and later Captain William Reynolds of the Topographical Engineers into territory few white men had seen. He warned the Army of the winters, the starvation, the sudden floods, but they rarely listened. When the government sent troops toward the Utah Territory during the Mormon Rebellion of 1857, they used his maps. The same lines that Bridger drew by campfire light would later form the routes of the Union Pacific Railroad, and yet, for all his service, he remained a man apart. Illiterate, weather-beaten, he spoke 6 native languages fluently, but could barely sign his name. He was loved and hated in equal measure, a man of the mountains, loyal only to the truth of the land. In his final years, Bridger settled near Westport, Missouri. His eyesight failed, his hearing dimmed, but his mind never faltered. Visitors would come just to hear him talk stories of geysers that spouted like thunder, of canyons carved by gods, of rivers that boiled from the earth. Some laughed, thinking the old trapper's mind had gone soft. Years later, explorers like Ferdinand Hayden and John Wesley Powell would confirm every word. He hadn't lied. He'd simply seen farther than anyone else. Historians today call him the Pathfinder's Pathfinder. Without Bridger's roots, Fremont, Carson, and even Lewis and Clark's successors might never have reached the Pacific in safety. His maps, though drawn from memory, matched modern surveys within miles. The man who never wrote a sentence had charted a quarter of a continent. Jim Bridger died in 1881, 77 years old. His grave still lies near Independence, Missouri, marked by a simple stone. It reads, "Celebrated as a hunter, trapper, fur trader, and guide. Discovered Great Salt Lake, 1824. The Yellowstone, 1830. The first passage through the South Pass, 1824. A man of great courage and enterprise. At the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, his rifle rests beside the journals of Smith and Larpenteur, mute steel and paper holding the same truth, that the map of the American West was not drawn by generals or politicians, but by men who bled on the trail. Bridger's story marks the twilight of the mountain men, that strange brotherhood who lived between wilderness and civilization. By the time of his death, railroads crossed the plains, telegraph lines sang in the wind, and buffalo herds were nearly gone. Yet somewhere out in the wide silence of the Green River country, you can still feel his shadow. The trails he opened are now highways, the passes named for him, but the land remembers the man who first walked it without fear. When the sun drops behind the Wind River Range and the coyotes start to call, it's easy to believe he's still out there, a solitary figure riding west toward the blue horizon, mapping the unknown one last time. The meadow was wide as the sky itself, a sea of wildflowers framed by snow-fed peaks and the whisper of pine. Beneath the blazing July sun, hundreds of trappers, traders, and native families gathered for what they did not yet know would be the last time whiskey flowed. Drums thundered, muskets cracked in salute. Around the fires, men with weathered faces and tattered buckskins shouted old names that already sounded like Myth, Smith, Bridger, Beckwourth, Carson, Sublette. They had all come for the same purpose as they always had, to trade, to drink, to celebrate another year of survival in the hardest land on earth. But this year, 1840, the mountains felt different. The beaver were gone. The trade was dying. And the wild freedom that had once defined the Rocky Mountain men was fading like the last smoke of a dying campfire. This was the final rendezvous, the end of an era. For nearly 2 decades, the fur trade had ruled the interior West. Beaver pelts, soft as velvet and strong as iron, were worth their weight in gold. In London, Paris, and St. Louis, they became hats, symbols of status worn by men who had never smelled pine smoke or bled from frostbite. Companies like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Hudson's Bay Company, and American Fur Company sent hundreds of men deep into the wilderness. They lived by steel traps, powder, and barter. A barter often conducted in sign language or pidgin French with tribes like the Crow, Flathead, Blackfeet, and Shoshone. At their peak, the annual rendezvous was the beating heart of this world. Every summer, in some hidden valley, trappers and traders would converge, bringing pelts down from the high country to exchange for powder, lead, blankets, tobacco, whiskey, and news. The air rang with gunfire, laughter, and the unholy din of men who'd spent the winter alone with only wolves for company. Charles Larpenteur, in his memoir, 40 Years a Fur Trader on the Upper Missouri, called it a carnival of wilderness, humanity both savage and civilized, where every vice and virtue wrestled in the same tent. But by 1840, the carnival was dying. The reason was simple. Europe had changed its taste. The beaver hat, the symbol of empire, had fallen from fashion, replaced by cheaper silk. At the same time, the over-trapping of the 1,820 and 1,830 had nearly wiped out the beaver population in the Rockies. Rivers that once glimmered with dams and lodges now ran empty. Fur companies collapsed one by one. Ashley's men retired. The Sublette brothers sold their interests. The once great Hudson's Bay Company shifted focus northward, leaving the interior plains to rust. Men like Kit Carson and Thomas Fitzpatrick turned to guiding military expeditions or leading emigrant trains, trading their traps for compasses and carbines. The frontier had shifted from wilderness to conquest. The Oregon Trail opened in 1841. The California Trail followed soon after. tens of thousands of settlers began to pour westward, rolling in waves of wagons that stretched from Independence to the Pacific. What had once been a silent continent now echoed with the creak of axles and the cries of children. And the mountain men, those feral princes of solitude, found themselves relics of a world that no longer needed them. That last rendezvous at the Green River was a strange affair. The journals preserved in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal tell of laughter that turned to silence when men realized there might never be another. Old comrades like Bridger and Vasquez traded their last pelts, drank toasts to the dead, and stared long at the mountains they had once ruled. "We have trapped the land dry," one anonymous trapper wrote. "What's left for a man who knows only how to hunt, fight, and freeze?" Some joined the Army as scouts, men like Jim Bridger, who guided soldiers through the Utah War and along the Yellowstone. Others, like Kit Carson, found new purpose as guides for the government expeditions of John C. Fremont, helping map the West for the coming flood of settlers. A few vanished into the wilderness, taking native wives and living out their days in forgotten valleys. And then there were the ones like Jedediah Smith, already long dead, killed by Comanches in 1831, his bones bleaching somewhere in the desert he had once conquered. To those who had known him, the death of Smith symbolized the death of their own kind. The mountain men had not only explored the West, they had embodied it. Fierce independence, restless movement, the belief that freedom meant walking into danger alone. But that kind of freedom had no place in a land now ruled by surveyors and statesmen. By 1860, the few who remained were curiosities, gray-haired figures who wandered into army forts or frontier towns, telling stories no one quite believed. They spoke of boiling geysers, burning rivers, and mountains where the snow turned pink at dusk. Their tales were dismissed as drunken fables until, decades later, explorers and scientists confirmed every word. The journals of James Willard Schultz, My Life as an Indian, and Bernard DeVoto's Across the Wide Missouri capture this twilight perfectly. The last true wilderness fading beneath the march of progress, its chroniclers old men haunted by the ghosts of the open plains. Even Charles Larpenteur, one of the last active fur traders, wrote in 1872, "The beaver, the buffalo, and the brave old trapper all gone. The world grows richer, and the heart grows poorer." By the time the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, the frontier that had birthed these men was gone. The wilderness had become geography. The map was full, and yet their spirit endures. Without the routes blazed by Smith, Bridger, and Beckwourth, there would be no Oregon Trail, no gold rush, no California, no America as we know it. The mountain men were the bridge between two worlds, the last inheritors of native wisdom and the first architects of a new nation. At the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming, there's a display titled The Last Rendezvous. Inside, behind glass, are the artifacts of that vanished brotherhood. Flintlocks blackened by campfire smoke, hand-forged traps, moccasins stitched with sinew, and a weathered journal inked by a trembling hand. The final entry reads, "The mountains will keep our names, the rivers will carry them." Outside, the wind still howls across the sage. It carries no songs, no shouts of trappers, no laughter of rendezvous nights, only silence, and the long memory of men who lived as free as the land itself. Historians call 1890 the year the frontier officially closed. The U.S. Census Bureau declared there was no longer any discernible line between settled and unsettled territory. But the truth is simpler. The frontier didn't close. It changed hands. The wilderness became memory, and the mountain men became myth. And perhaps that's fitting, for men who lived by legends deserve to die into them. When the dusk falls across the Rockies and the rivers turn to bronze, you can still imagine them there, Bridger, Carson, Beckwourth, Smith, gathered around a fire one last time, laughing, arguing, and drinking to the land they had loved too fiercely to tame. The last rendezvous never really ended. It just moved higher, into the thin air, where stories outlive men. The river shimmered gold under the noonday sun, not from the dust men came to steal, but from the light itself, caught in the moving current like molten glass. They called it the American River, though the people who lived along its banks had a different name for it long before James Marshall found his fateful flakes of gold there in 1848. To the Nisenan, a branch of the Maidu people, it was Kumayo, the long water. To them, gold was not treasure. It was the bones of the earth, sacred, not meant to be disturbed. When the first white men came with their pans, picks, and rifles, the Nisenan watched from the ridges, silent as deer. They had seen trappers before mountain men with moccasins and muskets who traded for beaver and moved on. But these new men were different. They came in swarms. By the summer of 1849, over 80,000 prospectors flooded into California, a migration larger than any the continent had ever seen. They came from Missouri, New England, Chile, China, and France. They carved paths through canyons, felled forests, poisoned rivers with mercury, and set up camps that rotted within a year. And yet, in all the chaos and greed, there was one tribe that refused to vanish, the Nisenan of the Middle Fork, who used cunning, patience, and a lifetime's knowledge of the land to turn the invaders' madness against them. This is their story, the one most history books forgot. Before the rush, the Nisenan lived in a network of small villages scattered through the Sierra foothills. Each had its own chief, Puidoc, spiritual leader, and complex system of trade. They hunted deer and elk, fished for salmon that shimmered like silver torches, and wove intricate baskets tighter than any white man's canteen. When Jedediah Smith's scouts and trappers passed through in the 1822, they recorded meeting peaceful and industrious people who kept to their hills and rarely fought with strangers. Charles Larpenteur later recalled in 40 Years a Fur Trader that the hill tribes of California were as sharp-minded as any man of street. Lewis, capable of navigating by starlight and tracking game by a single bent blade of grass. But by 1848, their world was about to be buried under a wave of gold fever. Within months of Marshall's discovery, their rivers filled with foreigners. Pans and sluices tore through the gravel beds. Mercury used by miners to separate gold from silt poisoned the water, killing the salmon runs the Nisenan depended on. The forests burned, the deer fled, villages fell to disease, brought by wagon trains. The government called it manifest destiny. To the Nisenan, it was apocalypse. Yet unlike many neighboring tribes who faced open war, the Nisenan chose another weapon: deception. They became, in the words of an 1854 San Francisco Chronicle report, the most clever tricksters the diggings had ever known. It began with rumors. Miners near the Middle Fork began hearing stories whispered by local Indians of a secret valley filled with mountains of yellow rock. Dozens of prospectors set out to find it, guided by Nisenan scouts who promised to lead them to the treasure. Days turned to weeks. The guides led them in circles through canyons so steep the mules gave out, through forests where every tree looked the same, until finally, exhausted and starving, the prospectors stumbled back to camp, broke and humiliated. The miners called it the Valley of Lies. But the truth was simpler. The Nisenan had lured them away from their sacred fishing grounds. Each lost expedition meant fewer shovels in the river, fewer men cutting down their oak groves. It worked. By 1851, the California gold rush had become a nightmare of violence. Bands of miners armed and half-mad with greed raided native camps for women, labor, and land. In retaliation, Nisenan warriors struck back under cover of darkness, cutting pack lines, burning supply caches, and collapsing mine shafts. They fought not with open battles, but with the land itself: flash floods, fallen logs, and poisoned wells. Even U.S. military patrols struggled to navigate the region's hidden passes. Captain John C. Fremont, during one such campaign, wrote in his journal, "The hills seem to close behind us, as if the very earth conspires with its people to drive us back." For the miners, it was a curse. For the Nisenan, it was survival. That winter, a new group of speculators arrived from Oregon. They brought with them maps crudely drawn charts said, to show a lost Spanish mine somewhere near the Middle Fork of the American River. Local Nisenan elders saw an opportunity. They confirmed the story, offering to guide the party to the supposed site in exchange for rifles and food. The miners agreed eagerly. For 3 weeks the guides led them across frozen ridges and down into ravines so deep the sunlight vanished by noon. When they finally reached the site, it was nothing more than a sheer granite cliff, no gold, no tunnels, no ore. When the miners turned in rage, their guides were gone, vanished into the pines. By the time they found their way back to civilization, half their mules were dead, their tools lost, and their supplies spent. One survivor later wrote in his diary, "The savages outwitted us at every turn. They know this land better than any map could ever tell." To this day, no historian has found evidence that the lost Spanish mine ever existed. But the story survives a quiet monument to the Nisenan's cunning. For all their ingenuity, the Nisenan could not stop the tide forever. By the late 1852, the U.S. government had begun forcibly removing them to small reservations in the Sacramento Valley. Those who resisted fled into the high country, vanishing into forests where no prospector dared follow. By 1870, less than 1/10 of their population remained, yet they never truly disappeared. James Willard Schultz, in My Life as an Indian, wrote of meeting old Nisenan traders in the 1882 who still carried small flakes of gold sewn into belts, not for wealth but remembrance. Today, descendants of the Nisenan still live near Nevada City, California, keepers of songs and stories that survived the storm. In 2019, the Nevada City Rancheria Nisenan tribe was officially recognized again by the state, reclaiming their name after more than a century of erasure. Their elders still speak of the Middle Fork, the river that both cursed and saved them, not as a place of gold, but as proof that cunning and patience can outlast conquest. Most history remembers the 49ers, the men who came, dug, and died chasing metal. Few remember the ones who outlived them. The Nisenan did not win by force, they won by outlasting greed. The gold they protected still lies beneath those hills, untouched not because no one found it, but because those who tried were led astray, one canyon at a time. And so the land kept its secret. If you stand on a ridge above the Middle Fork at sunset, when the light spills red over the rocks and the wind moves through the grass like whispered laughter, you might think you hear it, the ghosts of the tribe that outsmarted the world, the forgotten, undefeated people of the gold. The snow fell quietly that winter, a thin white veil over a land that had forgotten its own name. By then, the gold had mostly run out. The mines that once roared like furnaces now sat flooded and silent. The last of the great prospectors had drifted away, leaving behind ghost towns and broken dreams. But up in the foothills, beneath a ridge of black oaks and pines, an old man sat by a dying fire, a man the miners once called Old Jim, though among his people, the Nisenan, he was Chief Wepatoma. He was said to be over 70, though no one knew for certain. His hair was white as the Sierra snow, his face weathered like the granite cliffs of the Middle Fork. To the settlers of Nevada City, he was a curiosity, a relic from a vanished world. To his people, he was the last keeper of their songs. Wepatoma had been a child when the first wagons came, when the quiet rhythm of the Nisenan world was shattered by the noise of saws and gunfire. He remembered watching the river change color from clear green to a cloudy brown as miners dug its bed for gold. He remembered the first coughs that swept through the village sicknesses no shaman could cure. His father, a respected hunter, told him, "The strangers will take everything they can carry, and more, but the land itself will not forget." Those words stayed with him all his life. When he was grown, Wepatoma became a messenger, walking between Nisenan villages scattered across the foothills, warning others when soldiers or prospectors were near. He learned to read the forest like a map, to move unseen, to speak enough English and Spanish to bargain with miners when necessary and deceive them when needed. For decades, he survived by adaptation. But by the 1862, adaptation was no longer enough. In 1851, U.S. officials had promised California's tribes, including the Nisenan peace treaties and reserved lands. 18 treaties were drafted, not one was ratified. Congress sealed them in secret, locking them away for half a century. While paper promised peace, soldiers carried out the opposite. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and surviving families herded toward barren valleys. The Nisenan were no Dori exception. By 1865, most had been driven from the Middle Fork and the Yuba. Their traditional homeland, once a paradise of rivers, oaks, and meadows, had been carved into mining claims. Wepatoma refused to leave. He led a band of families deep into the canyons, people who still refused to bow. For years they lived as ghosts among the ruins of their villages, hunting by night, rebuilding what little they could. Local miners whispered of the silent ones of the foothills, Indians who appeared from nowhere, stole back their horses, and vanished like mist. Wepatoma never confirmed or denied those tales. But in his later years, when asked by the ethnographer Stephen Powers, whose Tribes of California was published in 1877, he said only, "We did not disappear. We became the trees." By the 1872, the war for the Sierra was over. The Nisenan were too few to fight, too proud to beg. Many took work as laborers in ranches and mines, building fences on lands that had once been their own. Wepatoma did something few others dared. He walked into town,